You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Lindsay Alfred Anderson. Alfred is a retired law enforcement officer and is the author of the nonfiction book Deputy Know Your Rights, A Cop's True Stories. I'm here with Alfred Anderson, who is the author of Deputy Know Your Rights, A Cop's True Stories, and there's also another book he's written. Alfred, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, it's nice being with you, Aaron.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm living in Northeast Washington at the time. I live between Northeast Washington half of the year and Costa Rica the other half of the year. I'm retired, of course, and before, one of my career opportunities was being a deputy sheriff in the west central mountains of Idaho, which was one of many parts of my life, but I consider it probably the best occupation or career I had. Very enjoyable and very educational. And I think what I try to do in the book Deputy Know Your Rights is to educate the general public on how abysmal all of our understanding is of our constitutional rights. And the purpose of the book is to write it from the perspective of an actual law enforcement officer that will help people understand how to interact with them.
Now, without spoiling too much of Deputy Know Your Rights, you mentioned a little bit about what it's about. If you could tell us some more about what it's about, that would be great. And why is it important?
Well, it basically started writing it about 4 years ago, after relating many anecdotal stories to friends. And, of course, what a lot of people say, oh, you need to write a book. It's so interesting. Excuse me. So I did begin it, and it kind of died in the vine for a while until I had a good friend suggest that I continue it. And the idea is that it's somewhat autobiographical, explaining how I became a sheriff, my career in law enforcement, and generally the book is with many anecdotal stories relating of my experiences through everything we did. A deputy sheriff is really underneath the sheriff, and the sheriff is the supreme power in his county. In other words, nobody can come in any county that is controlled by an elected sheriff and usurp his authority. FBI, BATF, any federal, state, or local agency, no matter what, can usurp the authority of the sheriff. So as a deputy, I enforced, the will of the sheriff according to what he wanted done throughout the county. Federal lands, state lands, local, cities, everywhere. And we pretty much covered every facet of law enforcement, whether it be traffic control, which I did a fair amount, domestic disputes, accidents, crime investigation, everything. And I include in the book a lot of those stories that some are very serious, some are sobering, some are very funny, but the whole point is to point out to the reader the purpose of and how important our Fourth, Fifth Amendments are when interacting with any law enforcement officer. And also I bring out how important the Second Amendment is, because really the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, which is constantly in the news, is not about self-defense. It's not about hunting. It's about maintaining the power of the people in their hands against a tyrannical government. And I include numerous quotes in the book from the Founding Fathers stating that point. That was the whole purpose of the Second Amendment. It is not about what congressmen and the press is always talking about. Well, what do you need an AR for to hunt a deer? Well, that's not the point, but it's never brought out in the press because they don't want people to understand the true purpose of the Second Amendment. It's about controlling a tyrannical government, which we now see in spades happening in our country, whether it be the First Amendment, people being put in jail for speaking out at the J6 demonstration, which is January 6th of 20. But it's important from the standpoint of when I, as a deputy, and I point that out, when I approach a car, a traffic stop, for instance, whether it be speed or whatever else, I simply just cannot stop anybody because I want to. I have to have what is called probable cause. And that's explained in the Fourth Amendment very clearly, that without probable cause, we have a right to protect our houses, our persons, places, papers, and effects against unwarranted search and seizure. And the point is, people just don't understand their rights. It's not educated, it's not taught, I should say, in the school systems, even when I was growing up, and I'm 71 years old. And it's sad because we have what is called a republic. It's not a democracy. And to kind of point that out a little bit, when Ben Franklin came out of the Constitutional Convention, when establishing the Constitution, a woman in Philadelphia stopped him and asked him, "What kind of government have you given us, sir?" And he replied, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." And the point is, it takes an educated, diligent, responsible citizenry to maintain their rights, to protect against tyranny that does and always does filter into government. And we see that constantly. It's sad. And even though, for instance, the Supreme Court and appellate courts have ruled well in favor of the Second Amendment, you still see states like New York and California and Washington trying to pass laws that are totally unconstitutional when it comes to the right to bear arms.
Without spoiling too much of your second book, what is that called and what is it about?
Well, that's a novel, and it's called Sasha, My Guardian Sasquatch. And it takes a theme, because up in the Northwest here, of course, Sasquatch is a big item. People have, there are hundreds of anecdotal stories about seeing them and hearing them and so on and so forth. So I wrote a book regarding that. Not that Sasha or the Sasquatch is a principal character throughout, but she plays, and it's a she because that's in the book. But it's about a deputy sheriff that is elected sheriff and encounters her in the woods, and she's trapped, and he releases her. Well, she comes into play later on in the book and saves him. He's battling against a Mexican cartel that's bringing in illegals and drugs from the north, which is actually happening. And it takes place in northeast Washington, in Pend Oreille County. It's a love story, combination criminal intrigue with interwoven this theme of a Sasquatch.
Now, are both of your books self-published, both of your books traditionally published, both of your books published via hybrid press, or did you use one way to publish your first book and then a second way for your other?
Well, they're considered self-published, but I used an agent, paid an agent to handle everything, and they're being sold worldwide. I have sales, from all over the world. On Deputy, Sasha just got published and is available. They're both available on Amazon.com in hardcover, softcover, and ebook. And Deputy will be out shortly in the audiobook form. Also through Barnes & Noble and all kinds of worldwide booksellers through the internet. But it's almost impossible to get a book published anymore through your major publishing houses, it costs a fortune, and you get so few royalties off the sale of those books. So, I felt that if I wanted to get a book out there, this is by far the best way to do it. And it's worked very well, because one can order, let's say, Deputy on Amazon, and they could either search through my name, Alfred Anderson, or through the title. And what they do in the self-publishing industry, and they're all over the world, they immediately publish that book and send it out. And it takes about a week to get the book, which is actually incredible when you think of the complicated process it takes. So it's kind of a hybrid, but it's, I used an agent, and the agent really helped guide me through the whole process. So I used that agent. She's a German agent, and I used him for both books, and I'm very pleased with the result.
Now, did you do any outlining for your first book, which was nonfiction, your second book, which was fiction, or both, or neither?
Well, the outline was in my head. I'm not the kind of person that'll sit down and, just say, all right, I'm going to write. I do, in my own mind, have a process by which I start books and finish books. So, and I've always known, I've read literally thousands of books myself, novels and nonfiction. But I found that the best way to start a book is to grab the reader. You have to write a chapter that physically or mentally grabs that reader and says, yeah, I want to read on. So like in the first chapter, Deputy, the first chapter is called 911 Hang-Up. And it's a situation where I go through at a midnight or middle of the morning, or night, I should say, 911 hang-up at about 3 a.m. in the morning. And I bring the reader with me in the present tense. I write in the present tense, and I want that reader to be with me as I experience, the thrill of running a high-speed emergency vehicle with lights and siren at times, and the thrill of, okay, what am I finding at the end of this drive? I'm out in the boonies, and I'm trying to figure out why was there a 911 hang-up. So that's the grabber, and then it goes into the process of how I decided to become a deputy, the process of becoming a deputy, and then hiring on with the department, and so on. So in my mind, I had the outline pretty well laid out. It's just that I hit the first 3 chapters, which pretty much stayed the same. I did modify them, and they just sat for 4 years, because I guess I didn't have the drive to really go further with it until the beginning of this year. A friend of mine who also who wrote a self-published book advised me that you need to finish the book, and this is the person to contact as far as helping you through it. So, and then from that point on, it flowed out. I mean, when it's a nonfiction, it's a personal part of my life. It's not hard to write about it. And then my brother read the book, and he says, wow, do you have any other books in you? And I said, no. I never thought of myself as an author, to be frank with you. But it's surprising when you finish one book and you see it in actual physical form. It's something to be proud of, because it's not something everybody does. With Sasha, they asked me if I had a novel in me, and I said no. And Aaron, as if it was an epiphany, that all of a sudden the whole theme of that book just was there. It literally was just in my head, as if God himself put it in there. He says, okay, write this book. This will be a good book. So that one only took me a month and a half to really write. And it just, I mean, I'd sit for hours, 8 hours at a day, and just type. And it flowed out very well. And that I didn't need much as far as an outline, as you asked about, because it was just, for some reason, it was there in my head, the whole story, how to proceed, how to end. In fact, I wrote the first chapter first, and then I wrote the last 2 chapters next. And then I filled it in between with the actual development of the characters and how Sasha comes into play several times. And many people, one person who has read it says, well, I was waiting for you. You know, the first chapter is about the encounter. It's what it's called, the encounter. And they wanted to know, well, I was expecting to see Sasha more in this book. And I said, well, she's a Sasquatch. You don't see them very well. They're mysterious. They're legendary. You're not something that you're going to develop into a friend, so to speak, like a dog, or they're very elusive and very secretive. And that has been borne out by many of the stories that I've heard about. I've personally never seen one or heard one, but I've got good friends around this area, and I'm in the northeast part of Washington, as I said, who have related stories that are just in this locale. And they all pretty much ring true to a lot of the anecdotal stories I hear about them.
Why are the 4th and 5th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution important? And I know the 4th Amendment deals with search warrants. I forgot what the 5th Amendment dealt with, to be honest, because...
That's the Miranda Act, the right to keep your mouth shut.
Oh, yeah, right to remain silent. Yeah.
Well, that's the Miranda Act, but it's the Fifth Amendment is your right against right not to
self-incriminate. I knew it was. My mind just blanked.
Yeah, well, and that's something that everybody, and I'm not to correct you or criticize you, but I had that same problem before I went into law enforcement. I just didn't realize how important especially those 2 are. Well, let's say I make a traffic stop. All right? I'll use the example for the 4th and then the 5th. I can't stop you without probable cause. Probable cause means a crime has been committed or is about to be committed. That's evidence. Now, when it comes to traffic, a traffic code has been violated. I can stop you, whether that's a tail light that's out, or speed, or just weaving in traffic, so on and so forth. Those are code violations. They're not arrestable until you get to a misdemeanor point, which in most states is like $1,000 fine, or when you're in prison or in jail, not prison. And the difference between jail and prison is for the long-term guys, the felons. So I have to have a reason and probable cause. I can't stop you just because you look at me wrong. I have to have probable cause. And so many people don't understand that. So I come up to your window, and I explain why I stopped you or the person. And I might ask you a question. First of all, driving is not a right. It is a privilege. It is granted by each state. And as part of that privilege, if I stop you or any law enforcement officer stops one, we have to produce our driver's license, proof of insurance, and registration. That's all. If I ask you how fast you were going, you don't answer those questions. If I ask you if you had anything to drink tonight, don't answer that question. Do you have anything in your car that I should be concerned about? You simply say, you respectfully say to that officer, "Sir, I prefer not to answer any of those questions." Well, and they might say, "Well, what are you afraid of?" You just simply say, "It's my right to keep my mouth shut." It's called the Fifth Amendment. And that's basically, as we recite it, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney, and so on and so forth. That's the Miranda Act, Miranda versus Arizona in
Yeah,
'66.
that was a major U.S. Supreme Court. Also, the right to an attorney is covered in the Sixth Amendment. So Miranda covers both the Amendments 5 and 6.
Yes, it really does, and it's because I forget Miranda's first name. He was Hispanic, but he just didn't know his rights, and that's really basically the reason for it, because people were ignorant. So we have to advise them of their right, so they don't talk. All right. If I've arrested someone because of some charge, warrant, outstanding warrant, whatever, I always advised them of their rights, because they're under my custody and they're under arrest. And if I wish to continue to question, then that Miranda right comes into play. However, if they sit in the back of my patrol unit and start talking and admit to things and so on and so forth, if I haven't advised them of their Miranda right, that can get thrown out because I didn't advise them. So as a practice, I always advised everybody, you have the right to remain silent. In other words, just shut up. Don't be blabbing and don't say things you shouldn't. Be kind, be courteous, be respectful of that law enforcement officer, but simply say, officer, I choose not to answer your questions. And he'll understand if he's a good officer. Okay. So that's the Fourth Amendment pretty much in a nutshell. The Fourth and Fifth in a nutshell. So basically, and that applies whether I stop you on the street or if it's in a vehicle or whatever. It's your Fourth Amendment guarantees you the right against unreasonable search and seizure. Now, continuing with the Fourth Amendment, if I get a warrant to search something, let's say a long rifle or a gun that's a long rifle. If I go into your house and it's specified, okay, this is what we're looking for. So if I go into your home looking for that rifle and I open up a small drawer and find something illegal, that's inadmissible. That's called fruit of the poisonous tree, because you're not going to put a rifle in a small drawer. You have to look in the logical places specified by the warrant where that gun is likely to be. Now, if in the process of searching logical places where it might be kept, I find other illegal items, those are admissible. But for instance, as I said, in a kitchen drawer or wherever else where they're not logical, that rifle is not going to be placed, that wouldn't be admissible.
My last question is, what is your opinion about policing in the United States today?
It's terrible. Unfortunately, too many police officers are going straight to their gun instead of using the normal process of force incrementation. There are a lot of examples where they're pulling their gun when there's no deadly force against them, and I explain that in the book as well. As far as force incrementation, you start with the uniform. That exudes a certain amount of command presence. Then it goes with your voice. Okay? Gets out of control, you might use a taser, you might use a baton, you might use OC. But if a person isn't liable to harm or hurt you or kill you without an item, such as a gun or a knife or a baseball bat or a hammer, you don't pull that sidearm. That sidearm is a last resort usage, and it's only against somebody that's within 21 feet of you that has something that can severely harm or kill you. When they get into that, and that was established by scientific and legal precedences of the distance that a person can cover before an officer can sufficiently respond in time. It's called action versus reaction. And typically the best reaction to an action is 0.75 seconds. 0.75 seconds.
That's 750 milliseconds or 3/4 of a second.
Exactly. And so if I see somebody that's got that, I'm not going to tell them freeze or stop like the typical Hollywood bullshit. My gun is out, and I'm going to stop him with 2 bullets. I double tap, technically, and if he still keeps coming, then I'll still keep shooting until he stops. Because he has something that could hurt me very severely or kill me. And that's whether it could be a car. If he's driving at me and his intent is to run me over, I'm shooting. Getting out of the way, but I'm going to...
Yeah, it's anything that is or can be used as a legal weapon.
Well, yeah. I mean, as far as a legal weapon in regards to the offender or the actual law enforcement officer, I didn't follow that question.
Alfred, thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast. It was wonderful to be able to interview you.
Well, it was a pleasure as well, and hopefully people will look up the book, and they'll find both of them, of course, on Amazon, and we always love to hear comments back.
My interview of Alfred is a very good example of a guest expressing a political opinion I disagree with and a political opinion I agree with. First off, the January 6th, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol was not merely a political disagreement. It was a violent attempt to prevent a duly elected president and vice president of the United States from taking office. And violent coup attempts are something that I believe are wrong and fundamentally anti-American. The U.S. Constitution does not explicitly grant anyone a right to rebellion, and there is a long tradition in this country of people having vastly different interpretations of our Constitution. However, Alfred's explainer on when law enforcement officers here in America should use lethal force against a perpetrator towards the end of the interview was very good and very detailed. Additionally, he provided a perspective that isn't often highlighted by national or local news media coverage here in America. Alfred was a wonderful guest for this podcast, and I hope to read his book soon. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.